Hello everyone. Today's story includes incredibly graphic material, some of which involves children. If you are sensitive to these types of things, please click away now. If you do choose to continue with the video, listener discretion is advised. My first pediatric call during my internship, first ever really, was a head-on collision between two drunk drivers. It came in as a low-level collision, which almost always gets canceled en route, or we just walked up and firefighters told us we could bail. This time, we were the first on the scene. I'm grabbing the jump bag and I hop out and see two just completely totaled cars. I walk a bit faster and I see my instructor's legs sticking out of the car. I get there and he pulls a little girl out with a very obvious skull fracture. We were out of there within 2 minutes. She wasn't restrained in her seat and the seat wasn't installed properly, so from 50 miles per hour to nothing instantly, she went flying in the car. I dropped the jump bag and left it, which had the IO kit. Weird that there wasn't one in the ambulance, but shit happens. We had a 30-minute transport where she was still breathing on her own, but we knew the entire time that there was no possible way she was going to make it out of this alive. I was able to get 2 IVs on her, which my instructor, a guy who never really gave out compliments, was so goddamn proud of me for. The entire time, the only thing I could really mutter was, "Fuck, man." But I was able to still get everything done. In the haste of everything, we completely ignored the other patients, but fire got there right as we were leaving. She didn't make it, I learned the next day, and we left early. Went from having a fun night watching movies at our post to that. I'm pretty sure that's how I looked when I hopped back into the rig after dropping her off at the hospital. I zoned out and didn't really react to anyone talking to me for a few seconds. A couple cops walked up and checked on me every once in a while. Supervisors, everyone was pretty concerned how I was going to take it. I still get bummed out whenever I see anything Dora the Explorer related almost a year later though, because she was wearing a shirt of her. So, it was 2009 I think. I had been a firefighter paramedic for about 6 years at this point. I was assigned to rescue, fire department ambulance, and we got a call for a pediatric code. Dead kid. When we got on scene, my lieutenant and I were the first ones to see this poor little lifeless boy at the bottom of an outdoor stairway. This was an apartment complex, and we were in the breezeway between floors, if that makes any sense. I asked the young man standing over him what was going on, and he's clearly in shock and not knowing how to say the right words. I see some vomit on the kid's blue lips and ask him if the kid was choking. The guy says,
"Yeah, he was choking on some pancake."
Okay, got it. We scoop the little guy up, load him in the back of the rig, and haul ass to the nearest ER. I'm trying to intubate him, and his airway is super swollen. I made a few attempts and then back off, and have the EMT bag him with an oxygen delivery device called a BVM. We continue to do compression on the way, and my paramedic partner gets a bone needle in the kid and is giving rounds of meds to help restart the heart. Get to the ER in what seems like 30 seconds, transfer to a bed, and start working on him in the ER. This goes on for about 20 minutes before the doc calls it and pronounces him dead. I fucking lost it. I just died inside seeing this poor little guy with tubes and needles laying on the bed completely lifeless. I went back out to the truck and started with the cleanup that we need to do in order to get back in service. Later that night, we got reports from the cops that the young man on the scene when we got there had actually murdered the kid and lied to us when we got there. He was the boyfriend of the kiddo's mom and beat him to death after the kid messed with the weed. That was pretty much the beginning of the end in terms of me wanting to continue my service. I'm in the process of becoming an EMT. So I've been volunteering in a small town near me to get some experience. Since it's a small town, it could go pretty slow. Anyway, there's a high population of elderly people. So I haven't gone to volunteer in about a month and a half, so I decided to go that day. It was about 10:30 and we got our first call. The medic that answered said something about a 44. I don't know what that is, so I asked and he said,
"It's a 44. The guy has his brains out."
And I was pretty excited, but this medic does bullshit sometimes. But they keep saying it's a 44, so I know it's something else. We get to the scene. Fire department and police department are there already. We walk into the house and the smell hits me. Smelled a little weird, but the guy was a hoarder, so I was like, it might be something else. We walk to the bedroom and there's this guy just laying on the floor with maggots and flies, skin all discolored, black, green, and purple. This dude was dead for about a week. There's another volunteer EMT there as well, so one of the medics, who is also a teacher, tells us what was the probable cause of death, health problems and stuff. So we asked the police department if they need an EKG strip, and they said yes, and we were all like, really? So we do it. Of course, there's no pulse. I'm pulling off the leads and the skin is wet and loose. It was pretty gross, but badass because it was new for me. So I found out what a 44 was. The first time I ever held a woman's hand as she died was also probably, not coincidentally, my very first major stabbing. I was relatively new, in a dangerous city, driving a 10-year-old truck with over 300 miles on it. Most of the people at my company did basic transfers or ran transport for fire departments in the surrounding suburbs. But the city's EMS department needed help, and our company provided some ambulances for them too. Most of the people working that station were sent there as punishment. I volunteered in a probably misguided mix of bravado and thirst for adrenaline. I was a basic EMT. I had no experience, and I was responding to 911 calls. So after a few short months, packed full of some pretty entertaining calls, our unit was called up on radio and we were sent to an address for a woman in her mid-40s who had been stabbed. The suspect was still on the scene. There were children still on the scene, and our scout, or police unit, was dispatched, not yet en route. So we pulled up the address, turned on our sirens, and booked it. It was quite a long way for such a serious call. It took us probably 6 minutes to arrive at the block of burnt-down houses and overgrown grass. We saw the police, and then we saw the knife, and then we saw the blood, and then we saw the patient. She was, as we were told, in her mid-40s. She was black. She was wearing a sundress, and she had very much been stabbed. Her left arm was covered in blood. It had soaked through the towel she was covering the wound with, and was now dripping fat blobs of bright red blood onto the pavement. My partner tried to get some ID and medical history, while I began to get down to the business of making all the bleeding stop. The wound itself was quite small, maybe 1 inch wide at the most, but it was on the underside of her bicep, and what we were told had once been a steady flow of spurting red blood was looking now more like a dribble. Any EMTs reading this will have noticed major red flags by now. But for those unaware, your brachial artery runs right where this woman got stabbed, and the bright color mixed with spurts of blood indicate an arterial bleed in no uncertain terms. So it was serious. I clamped a hand around our patient's brachial artery and began applying a pressure bandage. My partner and I helped her to our stretcher and began loading her into the ambulance, and this is when things began to go bad. At some point between locking in the stretcher and closing the ambulance doors, our patient went downhill very quickly. My partner had already begun taking vitals, but when I turned around, I found that instead of the woman who had seemed bemused and maybe slightly frustrated at her injury, I now had one clutching for my hands, eyes suddenly wide open and staring at me, asking me, "Am I going to die?" Of course not. I was busy getting a mask to give her some oxygen, but when I began to place it on her, she stopped me and asked again, then again, and probably 20 more times until she finally bolted upright against the straps on our stretcher and told me, staring into my eyes, clutching at my hands, "I'm going to die now. Oh fuck, I shit myself." With that, our patient's eyes rolled upwards, she slumped back and began seizing. My partner looks at me and we both know it's time to drive, fast. I walk around to the driver's seat and as soon as I slam the door, My partner hands me our radio and tells me that our patient has stopped seizing and has also stopped breathing. He would have to fit an airway and probably end up doing CPR, which means I'd be the one calling in the report to the hospital, not knowing any of our patient's medical history, vitals, or even her actual age. I didn't realize this until I was already flying down the freeway with our receiving hospital on the line. I must have sounded like an absolute idiot trying to decipher my partner's vague yells to figure out what vitals to give the hospital, relaying the half-complete information to a triage nurse, and all the while trying to not kill everyone on board and in my immediate surroundings. Probably 30 seconds before we arrived at the hospital, my partner starts yelling again. She was breathing on her own again. He fucking saved her. We fucking saved her. We brought this woman back from the fucking dead. We pulled into the ambulance bay like conquering heroes, boldly strutting past the triage desk and heading straight into rescue. Our egos were deflated pretty quickly once we wandered in. My partner got probably 10 seconds into his report before the nurses began snapping at us. Why is she breathing? You said she had lost her respiratory drive. You said this was major trauma. That's a tiny wound. What can be so bad about that? We tried to answer. We told them about the arterial indications. We told them about her bottomed-out blood pressure. We told them about her seizure and respiratory arrest. We asked them why they thought we had a king tube placed if she'd been breathing fine the whole time. But they didn't want to listen. She was treated well, I'm sure, but we knew they didn't believe it was as serious as we made it out to be. Whatever. It had been the last run of our day. We were covered in sweat and blood, and my partner made it back to the passenger seat before he put his head in his hands and cried. I didn't know what to say, so I told him the truth. We saved her, man. You fucking saved her. I ended up getting a letter probably 3 months later from the hospital. It was pretty cryptically worded, but it made a reference to the arterial indications that we had brought up and congratulated us on our care. Then it said, unfortunately, your patient was found pulseless post-surgery. So that was that. She had probably died that same night even. So there it is, my first major stabbing, my first major save, and my first major loss. Thanks for listening. For those of you who don't know, I work as a paramedic in South San Diego. It's not like me to share something like this in such a public forum, but I'm hoping one of you assholes will think twice about drinking and driving. A few hours ago, I pulled up to the scene of a traffic accident where one car rested on its roof and the other into a brick wall. There was a woman sitting on the curb, covered in blood, holding a child in her lap who had been severed into 2 pieces. She repeatedly placed her son's head on top of his body, attempting to make him whole again. Across the intersection was a man frantically running towards me with a lifeless little girl in his arms. As I stepped out of the ambulance, the man literally threw his 7-year-old daughter into my arms. He stood by and watched my coworkers and I put drug after drug into her veins, a tube down her throat, and electricity through her body. The car was T-boned in an intersection by a drunk driver who ran a red light at 60 miles per hour. The girl was ejected 40 feet out of her window, and the boy's head was severed by the bumper of the driver's lifted truck. Both parents and the severely intoxicated driver walked away, while both children now lay to rest. I watched a family get destroyed today. Don't be a fucking idiot. It is never okay to sit behind the wheel when you're drunk, and it's always appropriate to stop a drunk person from driving.